And good evening and welcome to this special Zoom event and Facebook Live event for the first 25 years of NABBA, sort of reunion of sorts. This has been set up by Pat Herak and doing most of the technical stuff, and myself moderating. And we have some great guests. You can probably see their names in the screen when they talk. But we're going to we have a variety of sections that are going to take us back through the years. But to start off, we want to kind of get everybody an introduction to who these people are. So they're going to start off with who they are and how they got started in brass bands. And also we're going to talk a little bit about the first president, Perry Watson. I'll start off with this, and I'll be very quick because my involvement is much less than theirs. But I started in brass bands when I was a student at the University of Kentucky, and the first band that I played in was the Lexington Brass Band under Dr. Holz down in the corner there. And at the time I didn't realize how important that was going to be in my life, but it ended up being something very big after I turned into my professional life and spending time doing youth bands in the Triangle Brass Band. The interesting thing about being here in Raleigh with the Triangle Brass Band is that the Triangle Brass Band is the band that Perry Watson started. And Perry was at North Carolina State University, and he started with the first competition. He's held other competitions here in Raleigh. And over the years, especially when Dr. Watson passed away, we had members of his family that came to a concert, and we did a little tribute to him at that concert. We played the Kingdom Triumphant, which the family really, really appreciated. So we've even named one of our youth bands the Watson Brass Band to commemorate the contributions that Perry had to the Triangle area and to brass bands in general. So, I personally never met Dr. Watson. I wish I had, but I'm sure that everyone on the panel here has some great stories they can talk about that. So I will turn it over to, we'll go in order. So we'll go to Dr. Paul Droste to talk about his beginnings and his recollections with Perry Watson. Dr. Droste.
Be glad to do that, and cut me off if I go too long. Perry was the George Washington to the NABBA organization, and I was his John Adams. I guess I looked at it that way. He brought me on board early on. I think one of my original background in brass bands just happened to be the Ohio State Marching Band, which we keep telling ourselves is the world's largest all brass band. But the director that I was under, Jack Evans, loved marches, good British marches, occasionally a Salvation Army march. And so we had a little indoctrination there. And back in the late 50s, mid 50s, the International Staff Band from London came to Columbus, Ohio and put on a concert. And Jack Evans literally ordered us to go attend the concert. This was a chance of a lifetime, so I did, and was, of course, completely taken aback by what I heard. Perry moved on me pretty fast. We needed, for championship number 3, a host. Volunteered Columbus, Ohio, actually Dublin, a suburb, to do that. And like in many organizations, if you host a convention, why, you're on the line to become president. And both of those happened to me in the same year of 1987. So Perry basically nominated me and railroaded me through to be president, and I did 2 terms for that. So great memories of Perry. I attended one of his brass band workshops in, I guess it's in Raleigh. Yeah, it's in Raleigh. And when he stopped doing those, I picked those up along with Yamaha. And I think I did 40 some of those through the years. Generous support from Yamaha, but with NABBA support and blessing as well. So I was able really to follow in Perry's footsteps. So I think I'll stop there.
Okay, so who's next? Next will be Tom Palmateer. Nope.
Yep.
It will be Tom Meyers.
Tom Meyers.
Yep. Okay, your question was, how did I get involved in brass bands? That's the first question?
Yes.
This is it. All right, cut it. And so those are 33 1/3 recordings by Ohio State. And that was the opening track of the second album. This is the first album. And when I heard that fanfare, I said, I am going to Ohio State to play in the band. I don't care about anything else, I'm going to be in the band. And of course, that was the introduction into a band, marching band that was a brass band. And eventually, at some point, I had, of course, gone on in years and asked someone about, did they want to start a brass band, about when I was 40. And my Ohio State colleague said, no, but you need to talk to Paul Droste. And so I called Paul, and Paul said, oh yeah, and you need to talk to Perry Watson as well. And so that's how that happened. I did meet Perry through Paul and attended one of Perry's brass band clinics. And of course, we were on the board together. I had a good relationship with Perry. He was always rather modest about his leadership role in the brass band resurgence in North America. And he claimed that it was mostly about selling brass band music, which of course, I did not believe for one moment. He was relentless in his support for NABBA and brass bands. How did I become president? Well, I made the mistake of being in too many chairs. And my years as president was a period of sustaining, no big changes, except, Ron, that the bridge was finally being published on schedule. Next.
Okay, next we'll welcome in Katie Kneeburg, and you'll be up next. Welcome.
Hey.
How you doing?
Hanging in there. I don't know what my presence really is in this, other than to say, hi, John Lambert, we meet again.
Yeah,
I've been out of this for so long, I don't know what to tell you. What do you need to know?
Well, we want to know how you got into brass bands, how you came to be president, and what recollections you have of Perry Watson.
Well, I never was president of NABBA. I was vice president. I was editor of The Bridge for quite some time, and founder of Sunshine Brass, not co-founder, but that's okay. How did I get into brass bands? Well, when I was in college at USF, I had a gig with the Salvation Army in St. Pete teaching their youth band. And Don, my husband, has always been a brass band fan. He had a bunch of old Salvation Army recordings. But anyway, I got hooked up on it and tried to present to them, the Salvation Army youth people, to let me, start a brass band down there, with all their instruments. And, that wasn't going to fly because they have their rules and all that. So I just decided I'm graduating. I'm not going to be a band director. So I'm just going to do this instead. So I found the instruments and started a community brass band and had a great time. I have no bad memories.
Okay, we'll move on to, next will be Tom Meyers. Wait, we already did you, sorry.
Yep.
Ron Holz. Ron Holz is next.
Yep.
All right. Well, I was born in a brass band. My father was director of the New York Staff Band, so I grew up in the brass band culture of the Salvation Army. My involvement with NABBA comes as a courtesy of Paul Droste. he and I had begun to have joint programs with the BBC and the Salvation Army Student Fellowship Brass Band of Asbury University. And one day Paul said, we're hosting NABBA, come on up and observe. I did, and within a few months he convinced me to come on board, and I assisted and became co-controller the next year when the contest was held in New Jersey, essentially learning the ropes from Mike Swaffer. Soon I was on the board. Soon I was vice president to Don Kneeburg and also vice president to Tom Meyers. I was chairman at Asbury at the time. And by the way, it was during that time that Perry Watson and I got to know each other, not just from NABBA, we were both chairs of music departments. So Perry and I had a lot of interaction from that perspective. So after serving 4 years as vice president, NABBA Bridge editor, I eventually became president. So that's the basic idea. But I have to say it's Paul Droste's persuasion. That's why I ended up doing a lot in NABBA.
I didn't twist your arm too hard, did I, Ron?
Not really.
Just hard enough. All right, Tom Palmatier is up next.
Okay, well, my introduction to brass bands was, I think, probably unlike anyone else's because I was reassigned to the U.S. Army Band, and after I arrived there, they told me, "Oh, by the way, one of your duties is to be director of the Army Brass Band." And I had done a lot of brass choirs, so I just assumed that's what it was. So imagine my shock when I got the stack of scores and saw all those treble clefs and those funny instruments that I didn't know what they were. So here I was, you know, becoming the director of one of the better brass bands in the country with not having 1 minute of experience with it. So I went on a deep dive of listening and learning and going to Britain and just diving in as hard as I could. Hosted a couple times, worked as the selling ads for the bridge and for the annual convention, and spent 4 years as Ron Holz's vice president and followed Ron as president. I think, I don't know, maybe we'll get to this later, but I think that I kind of view that whole 6 years as one continuum because Ron and I work so well together with his expertise in the contest, really understanding the ins and outs and the nuts and bolts of having been controller. And that was the time when this strange thing called the internet was just starting to emerge. Yep. And so I kind of took it as my challenge to help us move us toward a more of a digital footprint, because the cost of printing and mailing the bridge was basically eating our lunch. So that's where when we started moving it, and that was hard. A lot of the members wanted no part of going away from hard copy, and so we went with the dual product for quite a while. But that was when, you know, we stood up a website at that time. So I think that's, you know, Ron and I worked so closely together with him, really making sure the contests not only were high quality musically, but just to make sure that they were run so professionally that everybody that participated felt like they had a fair shot. And I kind of focused on the forward-looking stuff. So yeah. In terms of Perry, I'm sure I met him, but I really didn't have very much interaction with him at all. Burt Wiley was kind of the old hand at that time. So.
Excellent. Now we'll turn it on to Anita.
Well, like Ron and so many others, I grew up in the Salvation Army, so brass banding was in my family, my heritage, and in my blood, actually. The church I went to every Sunday had a brass band, so I played every Sunday in a brass band, and was totally involved in Star Lake Music Camp in the brass banding there. So that was my brass banding life, really, until I came to Cincinnati. And a gentleman by the name of Bill Harvey, we were good friends in college. He said, "What do you think about starting a brass band in Cincinnati?" I said, I would love that. And so we started the brass band in Cincinnati. And when in that process of starting the brass band, Paul Droste, I don't know if you remember this, Paul, but you came, it was the Yamaha thing with the instruments, came to Cincinnati, and Jerry Amon and his wife came and supported it. And we said, do we really want to start a brass band? So we actually did. That was the start right there. And Paul helped us. And as far as being on the board, Ron Holz said to me, "Anita, you need to be on the board." It was not a question or anything. He said, "You need to be on the board." So I saluted and I obeyed Ron, and I got on the board. And I was on there for a few years. And at one of the meetings, it was a total surprise to me. I forget the gentleman who said, you're on the slot to be vice president. I didn't even know it. But then I became vice president. Tom, you were the president. And then after that, it just progressed after that I became the president. And I thoroughly I'm still on the board now, ex officio, but been on the board for a long, long time and seen the progression. I never got to meet Perry Watson. If I did, I forgot it, but I don't think I ever did. But way back, Paul Droste and Ron, and just right up through now. It's been an adventure.
Okay, and we have one more panelist here to go, and that's John Lambert. So let's hear your story.
Hi, everyone. It's a real honor to be part of this panel, and thanks for having me on board here. I never was a president or on the NABBA board, so I digress to all of your expertise in that area, but I do have some stories because I'm pretty old. And I can give a few things. Like Anita and Ron, I grew up in the Salvation Army circles and attended all of the camps that were available. My mom and dad were Salvation Army ministers, and we were, at that point, when I was a kid, we were in New Brunswick, New Jersey, when it was not the New Brunswick, New Jersey it is today. And my parents were pretty much the only people there, a few older folks, and me, 5 years old. So we would go out and do street ministries, which in the Army we call their ministry. And it was my dad was the band on trombone. So he needed a second part, so he taught me as a 5-year-old the second part to about 6 in the hymn book. So the band became 2, and then we were out on the street doing our street ministry. So that's how I got started. in brass band and came up through, like Anita was saying, Starlight Music Camp and a lot of those programs. I got drafted into the New York Staff Band when I was 15.
Mm.
It was a little bit young to be in the band, actually, I think at that point, looking back. But I was there for 4 or 5 years, and I played a lot of repertoire, did a lot of playing. But at one point, I went off to Mexico City to play in an orchestra there for a couple of seasons. And that was, I came back in '81 to New York. And it was in 1982 that I started Gramercy Brass, amongst many of my friends in the city, colleagues of mine. And I also rejoined the New York Staff Band for that 1 year. And so I was in the band that came to NABBA as the guest of honor brass band. And that must have been 1983. Would that have been the first NABBA, 1983?
Yeah.
Possibly. So we were there. I played, and I got Perry Watson. And I spoke to him at one point, and I said, Perry, you might be interested to know that you started a brass band in New York City, and it's not a Salvation Army band. It's a regular brass band of players in New York. And he said, well, of course, you're going to come back to the next NABBA competition. And I looked at him and I said, really? Do you think that would be appropriate? And he said, absolutely. And I said, Perry, you understand what potential controversy this is going to be? If I show up to NABBA with a band from New York, I said, what do you think of that? And he said, that's what I want. I want you to come. I want you to stir up the cage or rattle the cage. So we did. We came 1984, and we played and won. The follow that was in Westchester, Pennsylvania. I don't know if any of you were in there for that, but the following year, 1985, it was in Toronto, Canada, and somehow we managed to get ourselves to Toronto, Canada, and play there as well. So, Perry Watson was a really mover shaker kind of guy. He saw a picture of how he visioned it and didn't hesitate to go for it. He was very appreciative that we came to NABBA to play for those 2 years. Rules began to change after that, and more people became involved. And it was a time for us to step out of that to do more concert work and things that we did in New York at that point. But yeah, Perry Watson also came to New York a couple of times. Is my internet hanging in there?
It's been breaking up quite a
I
bit.
guess you're able to hear me. Okay. For a long time in New York, we had the New York Brass Conference for Scholarships that ran every year. And Perry Watson came up and had a table for NABBA, and I hosted him for the weekend. His wife, whose first name I don't remember, but her last name was Purdy. They had a company called Purdy's Brass Connection, and they were sort of the resource for purchasing brass band music at that time. And every score, every purchase of brass band music came with transposed bass clef parts, treble clef parts rather, transposed into bass clef. So that was really pretty critical for an American band to be able to launch and get anywhere, is to have those parts. So I could go on, but that's about it for now.
And we have one more. We'll give Pat.
Okay, I'll just jump in real quick. I actually kind of was a late bloomer. I didn't start playing an instrument until 10th grade. Somebody had moved away from out of town.
Someone told me
the spot
still on?
in marching band. And
someone told me that the cup had disappeared. I don't know if it's still around.
We're not quite sure where that is. So I didn't really start playing the brass instrument until 11th grade.
Did I not get heard a lot of what I said?
I think we got it. So it wasn't really until my junior and senior year that I played an instrument. Then I go to Ohio State, and I play in the Ohio State brass band, or marching band. And then, of course, playing under Paul in the Ohio Collegiate Brass and seeing Ron at the God and Country concerts and whatnot. And then, you know, everybody else at the NABBA championships since then. That's kind of my background and how I got into things. I guess as we go on to the next round and talk about some of these older contests, John had already mentioned how Gramercy had come in and won the second and third NABBAs in the top section. Katie, we just lost Katie. I was just going to ask her a question. Well, anyways, I guess I'll just throw it out there to anybody that wants to answer. What are some of those memories you remember from some of those early contests in the 80s and 90s?
Patrick, if I can jump in here.
Yeah.
First of all, John Lambert is still on. I attended, John, the NABBA number 2 in Westchester. I had been invited to judge the New Zealand brass band competition. I had never judged a brass band competition before. And I talked to Perry Watson, good old Perry, and he said, come on up to Westchester. This was even before our brass band of Columbus was competing. And he said, I'll let you sit with the judges. And 2 of the judges were Roy Newsom and Bill Himes. And I sat with both of them in the course of the competition. And they were making tape recording comments and writing things. And I heard everything they said into the tape. And by the end of the day, especially sitting with Roy, I had a pretty good idea of what a good brass band sound was and what the proper interpretations were. And John, I was mightily impressed with your band. You kind of became what we were aiming to be when we started competing with the brass band of Columbus. I don't think we ever competed against each other, but you were the spur in my saddle, so to speak. So thank you very much for that. And Katie was there, of course, with the Sunshine Band winning those.
Thank you.
So I owe an awful lot to that competition in Westchester. That opened my eyes to many things.
Tom or Ron or Thomas or Anita, any other comments about some of those early contests? Or do any of you remember the whole video contest thing or how that was going? Who was president during that time?
Well, it began, I think Diane your wife has a whole page on it, Patrick, in her history. About 85, 86, NABBA felt it was a good idea to start having a way for bands who couldn't travel to the contest site to send in a video. It ran for about 5, 6 years. Eastern Iowa always won. And basically, it ran okay for about 5 years, and then just interest died because I think for one thing, Eastern Iowa kept winning, and the number of bands that entered was small. That's all. But it certainly was a value at the time.
Katie, we were going to ask you, and we're glad to have you back. Sunshine, we know, won the, I believe it was called the honor section at the time.
Correct.
In, the second and third NABBA, and you were going all the way to Pennsylvania and Toronto from Florida. How did you guys manage it back in that day and age? Did you drive? Did you fly? Or?
Oh dear. It was actually 84, 85, and 86. We won the first hat trick. I think it was 80. Yeah, because the first NABBA was 83, right? The first championships was 83. Yeah. So,
84, 85, 86.
I'm sorry?
84, 85, 86 is when you guys won, yes.
Yeah. So it was bad. Let me get the program here. My memory is not so good. Oh yeah, so the first year that we went was Westchester, Pennsylvania. And
then Toronto.
Yeah, and then somewhere. Anyway, I just remember one year, I believe it was the first year, yeah, Westchester, we took a bus, which was interesting, you know, with all adults and all that sort of thing. The second year in Canada, part of us drove an RV, bad decision, and the other smarter people in the band flew. I was in the RV and we had trouble getting across the border, and you know, what are we doing with all these instruments and all that sort of thing. And then although we all got there, you know, safely and everything, it was just, you know, you do better when you know better. I guess it took us 3 years to figure out to do better. And then wasn't the last one we were in 80?
In Indiana, Bloomington, Indiana.
Yeah, I think it was Indiana, and I don't even remember how I got there. I just don't remember. I do remember, I think it was Toronto trip that the Kirkland, and maybe Paul can remember this. Wasn't that the year Kirkland Lake Brass Band was in the...
Trying to think whether I was there at
let's see.
Particular one.
Here I sit with the programs. I'll have a look. But anyway, I remember that we were, you know, in some hotel ballroom rehearsing or something. We're all tired. We're, you know, fried from driving an RV that just beat us all up. And of course, again, the smarter people that flew were, you know, having a hippo of a time. Anyway, we were doing this rehearsal, and somebody from the Kirkland Lake Brass Band, I don't remember if it was the conductor or who it was, came in and started ragging on us that, you know, we were 5 minutes overtime or something, that they've been on a traveling for, you know, like 4 hours or some ridiculous thing. I think I may have had a meltdown because I had just gotten out of this RV after I don't know how many hours, and then they left. That person left. Oh my, you look a little different, John Lambert. Yeah. Wait a minute, is this you? Is that you?
Yep.
That's him. So one of the things is, we're kind of move things along here, is you mentioned is your band was the first band to win the hat trick. Was the hat trick rule always in place when NABBA first started? And I'm just kind of curious how the rules may have evolved over those first 15 years that some of you were president of NABBA.
I think that happened, if it didn't happen while Perry was there, I know the brass band, the Columbus, won 3 in a row, and we were informed that we could be a gala band or sit out a year, but three was the limit.
Yeah, 3 was the limit. For, we got the hat, you know, we did it in that division, and so we were forced to go into the championship division, which was, you know, horrible for us. We couldn't do that, and but that was the rules, and so we did that. And by the way, if I keep going in and out, it's because I live in the middle of nowhere with, you know, a variable internet
Yeah, you're in what, Wyoming right now? Is that
Yeah,
correct?
I'm in Wyoming.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, that hat trick pushed us to go into the championship division. At least we weren't last that year, but that was tough. That was tough for us.
What are some of the other things, if some of you can help me out here, that evolved? I know we added a youth section. I think it was just championship and honors, and then they added challenge and explorer later. When did these sort of things start to take hold, and when did NABBA really start to grow that became necessitated?
Well, some of those early ones were, again, in the early years. Eric Aho was probably one of the first in the country to have youth bands. And they immediately came aboard at NABBA, and we had a youth class. And then since he had a high school band and a junior high band or a middle school band, we needed a separate category for that. So as NABBA grew, we added different categories, trying to, entice more people to come to the competition and not create things like what happened to Katie, that you win 3 years in a row and you're bumped up a section where you're not comfortable. So in those early years, as in any organization, there was a state of flux. We were kind of making up some things as we went along.
And some of
growing pains.
Some of what comes with adding sections is also adding more own or set pieces that were chosen for the bands. Did any of you ever feel like there was a time where you picked pieces that were way too easier or way too hard, and just, you're at the contest and you start thinking, might have done a better job on that in the past?
Well, I think the current boards have done a better job of that, but we were sort of a committee of the whole at our board meetings. And sometimes, Ron, I think you did a lot of research there when you came aboard and had at least some suggestions for us. But in the early years, it was just kind of bantering around the table, and somebody would mention a piece and somebody'd say, well, that'd be a good championship level or honors level. And so a lot of give and take, and probably not a really efficient way of doing things.
I remember a lot of the board meetings too, where we just sat for hours listening to pieces and deciding what pieces were appropriate for which sections. And I just going back, I see a steady evolving of the rules, and still to this day, I know, Tony, you know this, it's back and forth. Well, we tried this before. What should we do again? But I think after a number of years of listening to contest pieces, we decided to have the contest committee that would listen to the pieces and then bring them to the board, and that saved us a lot of time. And going back to the early years again, I remember going to Toronto for my first competition when it was back years in Toronto. And again, we started the brass band. I had no thoughts of entering the competition, but Paul, you were the one that said, you need to bring Cincinnati Brass Band to the competition. And so again, I thought, okay, I'll do what Paul tells me to do, and we'll bring our band to the competition. And we won that year. We won for several years. And what I think everybody is seeing is the growth of the bands, the progression of the excellence of the bands, and what we thought was a contest piece years ago for the championship section is now a contest piece for the first section, which we've changed names of the sections to. But it's
one last big question kind of on the contest is, as it changed over the years, I'm kind of curious back to where did some of these original ideas start? I mean, did you guys just all come up with stuff on your own, or did you go, here's how they do it in Great Britain, or here's how they do it in Australia and New Zealand, or this is the Salvation Army background behind things?
We did a lot of that, a lot of patterning, but this is before even Paul was involved. We did a lot of, with Perry, patterning off the British thing. I remember talking about, Great Britain, they put the judges behind.
It looks like Katie might have froze a little bit, and hopefully we'll get her back.
Well, I'll jump in here.
Yeah, thanks, Tom.
I think, clearly we use the British as a model, but what I thought one of the strengths was is that we didn't feel like it had to be that way. We did not have to be clones. And we needed, it's a completely different environment. Musical environment.
I think one of the evidences, Tom, and maybe you can expand on this a little bit, was earlier in NABBA, there would be extra players, and people would actually rotate in and out sometimes because we wanted to include as many players as possible, where in the UK, it's 28 players on stage and that's it.
Sure, yeah, exactly. And that was the reason. There were some bands that, as most of you know who are involved in a community band, to regularly field a community band of any given size, that band has to be larger throughout the year to cover down on absences and things like that. And it just never felt right to say, well, okay, you 5 or 6 that had been with the band the whole year aren't good enough to go to contests. And I think everybody felt that. And I think it was Ron that had the solution of, you can only have X number of people on stage, but you can swap them out if you need to. And that was a great help to those bands that had extra people that wanted to involve everybody. One year we went with judges unscreened, just to kind of see, okay, what difference does this make? It turns out that the membership and the board did not want to continue that, but I thought that was a strength, and I hope that's still the case with NABBA, that it's not like we're not necessarily worshiping at the knee of the way the Brits do it, or the way we did it 20 years ago, or something like that. We did the video thing, tried that. It eventually didn't work. We tried going without screen judges. We experimented with kind of bonus entertainment points that didn't count towards the winning, but we kind of scored them anyway. So I think that's a particular strength, and I hope that's something that's continuing, that you aren't just changing for change's sake, but you're open to trying new things, because this is not Great Britain.
When you mentioned the other points or whatnot, did that, until I think about 1994, there was also a Best Soloist prize, and bands would often play a solo on stage as well. Is that something that was worth extra points, or was that just a separate prize for that?
It was a separate prize,
Okay.
but it was required initially as soloist. The idea there was to have variety in the repertoire. Unfortunately, we went the other way, where it's just 2 test pieces. But in the early goings, the programs were very interesting because you had such great variety. You had a soloist featured, or a march, or a hymn tune, and then 8 shows a test piece. And that was a value, and I think it gave some bands that maybe were not as strong technically, but were better musically, a chance. Okay, now that evolved, and eventually bands just wanted to play test pieces, and that's the new model now. Basically, we don't even have gala concerts. We don't have reading bands or a chance for clinics, because we've become a large organization, and the amounts of time necessary for these contests. I will say one other thing, and adding on to what Tom has said, NABBA has always been very wise in its strategic planning when it's thought carefully. For instance, those of us who have judged in Great Britain know that over there is judge conferral. That does not happen now in NABBA. What you put down goes in, and you can have great variance between the judges, which is fair, because adjudication is not an exact science. It's an art. And so the sense of trying to make NABBA more like Great Britain, that's not the same thing. We are not them. We are what we are. And in many ways, when we are open to one another, and when we support one another, and when we congratulate one another on what we achieve, NABBA is one of the strongest amateur organizations that I know. And I think we should maintain that aspect of it as much as we can.
And,
That's
and,
50.
and I think both you and Tom brought up a point. I've heard, amateur organization and community bands. And I think all the early years of NABBA, there were rules. You cannot have professional players in bands. And that rule kind of changed just because it was very difficult to enforce. And now professional players are allowed. And I think we may have seen the quality of the NABBA bands go up because of that. But the question would be, how do we still keep that community feel that you're talking about, Ron? And if anybody has, advice on this, as we have, higher bands and more professional players involved with NABBA.
I'd like to tell a New Zealand story here, if I may, quickly. Just judging there in, 1984, I guess it was. I was accustomed in the high school competitions that there would always be a panel of 3 judges, as NABBA has had through the years. I got to New Zealand, and Norm Goffin and I were the 2 judges for everything. He did the first and third level bands. I did the second and fourth level bands. We also did solo competitions, even a marching competition, 1 judge. And so I asked the New Zealand host about, haven't you ever tried like a panel of 3 judges? And he said, oh yes, we tried it 1 year. And he said, 2 judges disagreed. Third one made the final decision. So we just decided we only needed to hire 1.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good.
Before we leave the discussion on video conferencing and interesting memories, I have 3, but I'm only going to do 2 because the third one is too long. One is on the video conference, and at one point I had served as the stage manager for the championships, which I did fairly often. And a player in the wings on the stage was ready to enter and said to me, "You're Tom Meyers, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." And he quietly said, "You changed the way I play." I then sent the band on stage. Now about the video competition. One year, there was only 1 video submitted, and I was tapped to judge the performance, which turned out to be a Christmas holiday concert. In my comments, first, I mentioned that the soloist played all the notes, but needed to let go and add your own expression. And I said, and that's scary at first, to be so revealing, but that is where the great music is made. Second was that as a soloist, you play the solo the way you want, and the conductor must follow you with the band. Their problem, not yours. You lead always. And that was the fellow years later who took the contest stage, first chair solo cornet with the Eastern Iowa Brass Band. So I figured out who that guy was. Second, in terms of the contest, the benefits of the contests, for me, the #1 benefit was meeting and becoming friends with the board members, the adjudicators, the composers, arrangers, band members, and the connections with the Salvation Army bands and the military service bands. And then even being confident enough to connect with the Chinese Army band in 2009 when I lived in Beijing. So that's my reflection on a person who was not in a competition band.
And I think that's another thing too, is the contest is what NABBA was known for, I think, a lot throughout its history, and even today. And outside the contest, we've had the Brass Band Bridge, which I think is a fantastic historical record. And in case you haven't heard, Andrew Wainwright, who was the editor of the British Bandsman, will now be the editor for the Brass Band Bridge, which is a great addition to what we're doing at NABBA. But I guess I would ask, how did NABBA in the early years address those non-contesting bands, other than like Tom's story? I know, Paul, you mentioned the Yamaha clinics. Anita, I think you might have taken over some of those as well later. Other than the contest, how do you feel like brass banding is taken off across the country as far as a non-contesting in that community band feel as well?
I think if I can put in a plug for Yamaha here, they sponsored Perry Watson at the beginning and me at the end. They would send a van load of musical instruments. 4 tubas, 2 or 3 euphoniums, all the horns, 8 or 10 cornets, timpani, bass drum, snare drum, a van load to these workshops. And all the players had to do, the local host just had to kind of recruit players, and we had all the instruments. I had all the music, and we'd have a Friday night and an all-day Saturday reading session and talking session, and maybe put on a short demonstration type concert at the end of that time, and then move on to the next one. So we didn't have 100% success of a brass band coming out of each of those workshops, but we had a pretty high percentage of them, and many of them are still in existence today, which meant we planted the seeds correctly and got them off to a good start. But Yamaha put thousands and thousands of dollars into that through the years. So cheers for them, because Anita, your band in Cincinnati was one.
Right.
We had the backing when we needed it. Johnny Woody was kind of the main honcho there at Yamaha, and he was on the NABBA board for a while.
So once the Wells Fargo wagon with all the instruments leaves, how did you folks go about getting your instruments? I know, Katie, you'd mentioned getting instruments is a struggle at the beginning. Anita with Cincinnati, John with Gramercy. I know in here, we kind of lucked out in Central Ohio for some of the later brass bands because the Ohio State Marching Band switched to mellophones. So there were a whole bunch of tenor horns left over, that we were able to borrow some of those. But for everybody else everywhere else, how did you go about finding the instruments before eBay?
I have a good story.
Oh,
Yeah, go ahead,
sorry.
Katie.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Katie.
Me?
Yeah.
I switched to my phone, by the way, because so I'm only getting one person's face at a time. I was teaching up at a small college up the road, like one student or something, and somebody up there, I think there's some brass instruments in the closet. I thought, well, okay, that's kind of cool. Well, as it turns out, there was a full set of brass band instruments in the closet.
Wow.
It used to be a boys' school long ago. So Don knew this woodwind guy at this particular college I was teaching this one student at, and said, what are you doing with those things? And he said, nothing, they're just collecting dust. So we were able to borrow the entire set. I mean, it was the universe was giving me a gift. They were pretty bad. The E-flat soprano was really stuffy and nasty, but I mean, at least we had all the right stuff. Obviously, we had euphonium players that had their own euphoniums, but I mean, in terms of the E-flat tubas and having the soprano cornet and the tenor horns, and baritones, that was just beautiful. So then, one at a time, we just started buying our own. That's how we got our first set. Was we just borrowed them from this, collecting dust in the closet.
What about you, Anita?
Well, right from the beginning, we just said we had to have the proper instrumentation, and we were fortunate on two things. Buddy Rogers' music was very helpful, and I had a lot of access to Salvation Army instruments that the band could at least borrow to get us through a few years until the membership could buy their own instruments. And also the Cincinnati Brass Band purchased official brass band instruments like the E-flat horns, E-flat tubas, a couple of baritones and cornets. And so the membership would be able to play on those instruments until at least they were able to purchase their own instruments. So that's how we did it, just kind of beg, borrow, not steal, but beg and borrow and purchase their own instruments. And right from the get-go, that's what we did.
John, what about Gramercy?
Yeah, it was kind of like borrowing. I mean, I had a lot of Salvation Army friends, and we were borrowing E-flat horns and baritones. Most everybody had cornets and trombones, so it was just those specific instruments that we needed. So it was a lot of borrowing for a long time. We got lucky in '95. We did a concert at Lincoln Center that Beston sponsored. And along with that came a whole set of instruments. So those instruments eventually went back to Beston, except a set of E-flat horns that stayed with us. So, you know, that's how we managed over time.
And then Tom, you had this.
Am I still breaking up?
Yeah, a little bit. And Tom, you had the Screamers and Lyric Brass Band up in Akron, correct?
Yes, for several years.
And how did you pick your instruments?
Well, the percussion I purchased, in so many words, just boom. Need a 36-inch bass, drum, got it. The instruments came with the players. In most cases, the difficult part was, of course, the E-flat horns. And there was a lot of experimenting with French horn mouthpieces on E-flat horns that were, you probably would have to say, rustic. That was also an area of Ohio where players who were pretty good expected to be paid to play in the group. So long story short is that the group didn't survive, but there were two successor bands that are still alive in the greater Akron area today.
Yeah.
And one has a set of cymbals and one has the bass drum.
Yeah, that would be, I believe, Freedom and Brass Band of Western Reserve.
Western Reserve, correct.
I'd like to tell a cornet story here, because starting the brass band of Columbus, I had access to faculty members of our School of Music, outstanding students, local band directors in the area. So there was really an excess of talent. But when the professor of trumpet at the university showed up for rehearsals with his trumpet instead of his cornet, we had to have an instant agreement. And the agreement I put forth to him is, if you own the best bench trumpet ever made and a con director cornet, I still want the cornet. And after a little bit, I mean, a little give and take there in those first couple months, why the players in the band themselves got together, and we had a music dealer amongst them, and he said, I'll get you a deal, tell me what you want. So they opted on Getson cornets. So within that first year or so, we went from a real hodgepodge of instruments to a match set of cornets. But the OSU marching band had the E-flat horns. School of Music had E-flat tubas that probably had 6 or 7 inches of dust on them because nobody was playing those anymore. So we got those, and I was able to finagle a couple of baritone horns, and so little by little we ended up with really some pretty good equipment. But that was the major challenge at that time, just finding the right horns.
I'd like to mention something here too, the International Music Camp. Paul,
yes,
you know that. When you went up to it, didn't you have some Yamaha instruments?
We did. We were still
yes.
with the Yamaha clinics, so they
right. And Wally Ost, who was on the board, pushed that music camp and pushed to have the brass band there. And Paul, you insisted that they have the brass band, British brass band instruments. And then you got me involved in it to take over for you. And people would show up with trumpets and French horns, and I said, no, Paul always said it has to be British brass band, and I'm continuing that. So we had to turn away. But then the last 4 or 5 years, people caught on. They had to come with the official British brass band instruments to play in that band, and it worked.
One of my early influences was, of course, the River City Brass Band in Pittsburgh. And Bob Burnett just did a marvelous job. He spent a whole year raising money and getting a pretty well-heeled board of directors before they even had the first rehearsal. So a lot of problems we had, how do you finance a band? Why, he had his sponsors all in line. But he told me, he said, we use cornets and trumpets. if we do a brass band test piece, we use the cornets, but the pop stuff and things, we use trumpets. He never did use the E-flat horns. They always had French horns. And that band was so successful that you really couldn't argue with them. I mean, they played very well and they sold out their concerts and did a lot of wonderful things for us, and including there was a brass band workshop probably in the mid-'80s, and they advertised it nationwide. So I paid my money and I went, and Don Stein from the Eastern Iowa Brass Band was there, and Pam Potter from, it's a tri-state band were there. Unfortunately, there were only 3 NABBA people that were there for the workshop, but we had access to the River City Band and to the Allegheny Band, and we got several hours with Roy Newsom every day, and this was an awfully big help to me as a new brass band director.
Pam Potter with the Mississippi River Brass Band?
Yes, that's what it was, yeah.
Okay. I got a little bit of the memory still going, not much, but.
Well, one of the things that could be a little bit of a tricky spot is talking about all the instruments is the use of tubas. We know that the British brass bands all use E-flat and B-flat basses, but how much experience have you had with the American training being primarily C tuba and F tuba? I remember going to performing in NABBA one year, and our tuba section had an E-flat, an F, a B-flat, and a C tuba. And the rules are allow for this, but what experience have you had with the sound of the tubas? I remember having Philip Harper here with the Corey Band rehearsing the Triangle Brass Band, and I tried to get him to corner him into saying that it's okay to use C tubas and F tubas because that's what we currently have in the Triangle Brass Band. But his only comment was the tubas sounded fine. I was like, well, that wasn't much. Didn't really help get into the difference between B flat and F, or B flat. E-flat and C-F, but what experiences have you had with dealing with getting tuba players to play with the types of instruments that they play and also reading the clef, proper clef?
Yeah, because 4 E-flat and B-flat tubas will cost you about, what, $40,000?
Yeah, I got a lot of, yeah, I got a lot of pushback from my tuba players who they wanted to play their Cs. Frankly, it's, a lot of the manufacturers are not making really great B flats now. That's part of the challenge. But if you can get those good large bore B flats, and you got to have quality horns, or else you're better off just saying play your Cs, play a horn that you can sound good on. But if you can get high quality B flats and E flats, it's physics. I mean, the overtones of the C's and the F's just don't line up with the rest of the band. There's a reason that a brass band has a very distinct tonality, and there's a reason why those F French horns stick out so wild. And I mean, whenever I heard River City Brass Band, I thought, well, it sounds great, except there's this thing in the middle that just doesn't fit. And it wasn't timbre, and it wasn't the quality of the players, it was just the overtone series didn't line up. So I think, what I had to do was just say, you can play your Cs until I can get you a real high quality, best I can find out there, B flats and E flats. And if I couldn't do that, then I've got to defer to the players.
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly, because you said it well about the overtone. I think having the C's and the F tubas and or French horns, it's sort of like an invasion in the of the family, because you've got this beautiful family set, all E flat and B flat, and then it throws things. But that's what we did too, is we said you can play whatever you have at the moment, but you'll graduate to the purest that we.
Yeah, Pat and Tony, I wonder if, and tell me if you don't want to, but if we, one of the topics that came up a little bit earlier, I think might be something worth you guys thinking about for the future, rather than us just, reminiscing about the past. And you talked about the tension, if you will, between bands that are built around contesting and bands that are community bands, that they've got a year-round constituency, that really is their bread and butter, and they might go to contests every year or just occasionally, but that's not their reason for existence. And you also mentioned the change in the programming, and that bands have started doing more just 2 test pieces. And I think that is part of it. And if NABBA is going to be part of fostering the growth of brass bands in North America, I think it's worth having a discussion about, what are you trying to foster? Are you trying to foster bands that are doing concerts throughout the year and being part of the musical community, or are we really just focused on the contest? And either one is okay, because I think a program of 2 test pieces is not congruent with a band that is doing community stuff throughout the year, because in most cases you don't want to play those test pieces for your normal audience, and you certainly aren't going to play 2 of them in the same concert.
Yeah, I wonder if the evolution of going towards 2 test pieces is something that had more of an effect of judging and what was successful.
Yes, yes, exactly. And I think that's what I think it's worth the current board having a real discussion about what do they really want to encourage going forward. And it might be leaving the current play whatever you want for the top section only, but then having some different guidance for lower sections where you're going to find more community bands that well, let's use Eastern Iowa, that also they had the 3 and they did the hat trick, and they would go up to championship and they'd get their butts kicked and then go back to where they were comfortable and where their style fit. And you're exactly right, it goes to judging. Now as Paul is also a member of American Bandmasters Association, I've been involved an awful lot with evaluating new members and deciding who can be invited to join. And we've had to become more and more prescriptive with, this is the type of program that you will submit to be nominated for membership, because left to their own devices, some of these leading wind ensemble directors will send in 2 30-minute pieces. And so we've had to actually say, you will play a march. Yep. And it's not going to be March from Symphonic Metamorphosis. It's going to be a march that at some time in its lifetime was printed on music this big. And to make sure that they are developing all parts of the genre and all parts of the repertoire. So I think you might want to consider what is NABBA really after, and does the judge, and you're absolutely right, people are playing 2 test pieces because those are the bands that continue to win. So so
I'll jump in for a minute there, Tom. I think we'd like to do everything, but that's difficult for us to do with just the North American Brass Band Championships, the NABBA Championships. But one thing, I don't know how familiar you are with other things that have popped up, but for instance, the US Open is now an entertainment contest.
I've judged US Open a couple times.
The Dublin Festival of Brass, you play a march, a hymn, and a test piece. So it's prescriptive, but it is a bit more audience friendly. Gateway is just a 30-minute program right now, and that's still evolving. And John Bell's in charge of that. The Ohio Brass Arts Festival, they'll play a 50-minute program, and they only get judged on a march and a slow melody, but the rest of it's just for the audience. And that's kind of more of a community band focus. So I guess the question is, as these things start to pop up, maybe we can provide more support to have a plan rather than just kind of random, things that hopefully encourage, because we do want to encourage all brass bands, community, as well as competition. But I think part of the goal of the North American Championships is to help those bands be ready to compete over in the UK if they get the invite.
Well, let me just weigh in here a little bit. One of the things we need to remember is that NABBA is not just for contests. While that may be the central gathering point, several things have not happened recently. We had you guys have a shall we say, a document that says what NABBA will do every year. For instance, you will have a meeting where the board is introduced, okay, and things will be discussed. There is no time anymore. This hasn't happened for years. You don't do that. But I think what you can do is encourage bands that are not competing bands to be part of NABBA. Sorry to talk about my own band, my Lexington Brass Band for 22 years that I directed, competed. But we did do gala concerts, and we did support and sponsor regional festivals that were not competitive, but brought bands in. Paul came down and was an evaluator one year. We brought bands from, oh gosh, I don't know, there were 5 or 6 bands. We're having it now down in Georgia. Joe Johnson's doing it. It's non-competitive. It's people playing for one another. Foster that. And we used to give money, and I think we still do. If you are having a regional festival, apply early, and NABBA gives you a grant that helps you run the event, okay? And I think if we can encourage this and through the bridge on a regular basis of communication, get people sharing with one another what they're doing on a community level. Just for a moment, the contest is going to take care of itself. It really is. But ultimately is, what are we as a organization that sponsors year-round music making, quality music making? That's what you need to find a way of sponsoring. The contests do improve us technically. There's no question about it. But if you put all your eggs in that one basket, you're going to find that that's the only thing that improves, and that on the very high level. With, as you've seen and noticed, professional players now being hired, so the one band can get an up advantage on another band, because that's all that matters anymore. So I would suggest the board revisit, what do they want to be? And Tom Palmateer can talk a good deal about our long-term strategic planning, thoughts we had of where we were going. But that seems to have just kind of gone under the rug, as we just get so concerned about year in and year out running a contest. So contests are great. We need to do them. They're wonderful, the organization. What else can you do?
Yeah,
oh, sorry, Tom.
What Ron is alluding to is we spent one of our off-cycle meetings not doing nuts and bolts.
Right.
I mean, where we examined, what are we really about? What are the values? What are the guiding values that will guide us on long term, not just where are we going to have the contest next year? And so I would encourage the board to every 2-3 years, it needs to have that kind of,
yes,
look into the 20 years from now, and what do we really exist for? Because when you have, I'll just plug one book. It's called Built to Last, and it's about organizations that have been on top of the heap corporately for 40, 50, 60 years, and it's every single one of them. The common thing was, they had a core set of values that they stuck to, even when the market changed, when music changed, when media changed, when the internet, doesn't matter. They have a core set of values. And so I think it's worth refreshing those every once in a while. And they don't have to stay the same. They should evolve. So Anita, I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's all right. That's one of the reasons when I was president, we started the Silver Bells capital campaign. We did not raise as much as we wanted to, but we raised quite a bit of money, and this money went towards festivals throughout the country where brass bands could participate and support clinics, brass band clinics, and it ended up supporting, well, I wrote down a few things, the Northwest regional contest. We helped Dublin for the festivals, if I'm correct, Pat, right? And Chicago, they had a festival.
Mid-Atlantic as well.
Atlantic. So now that money's dried out almost now, if not dried out, but it did support a lot of that. And also, ever since I started conducting Cincinnati Brass Band, I always said to everybody, I want this to be a community band, not just a contest band. And we played throughout the year. We played summer concerts, Christmas concerts. When we went to competition, we focused on those contest pieces, but that was not our only existence. We wanted to play for the community and not just have professional players in there. We had very few professional players in there, but very good players. We maintained that standard, but we wanted to be a community brass band.
And I think one of the things that also makes it difficult is, depending on where you are in the country, your resources, players, connections to music stores, commutes to band rehearsal can all vary so much that there's not a single silver bullet for helping, one band or get one band started. The circumstances that Sunshine started versus Gramercy versus Screamers and Lyrics versus in Columbus with all the Ohio State Marching Band connections, the Salvation Army connections in Asbury, mean that we have to be as open-minded as possible because different people have different challenges.
That's the wonderful thing about the International Music Camp, Paul. When I would go and conduct that, as usual, Paul, people would come there. They said, this is my only chance to play in a brass band. The closest brass band to me is 3 hours away. And so, of course, they can't participate. They said, I love coming to the International Music Camp. It's my only chance to play in a brass band.
Anita, is that the one in Minot?
It's not quite in Minot, but you have to, Minot is the last airport. Okay. But you fly to Minot. It's right on the border, right at the International Peace Gardens, the border of North Dakota and Manitoba.
Mm.
All right. Well, we've been at this for an hour and 20 minutes almost. So I think we should take an opportunity here for any wrap-up comments or any other ideas that you might want to share with everybody about your experiences as president or a leader in the blooming organization that is NABBA.
I just have one funny story that my husband and I both remembered from one contest that I would like to share. It had to do with the curtain versus the black box that the judges were in. So we're on stage. I think I had 2 solo cornets that year, and there was just a lot of empty seats. Anyway, at the end of our performance, the photographer says loudly, "Sunshine, please hold," for our photograph, and we all just came unglued because, of course, it's supposed to be, they're not supposed to know who we were, and we all just sort of got a big laugh out of that. But that was, I guess, whoever the controller was that year didn't make a big enough effort to the photography people to let them know they weren't supposed to say that. That was just pretty funny.
I remember that.
Did you?
Probably happened in Columbus.
Oh, did it?
It
I
might
don't
have.
remember where it happened, but every time, Don and I would get a camera or something, we'd do a funny thing and say, "Sunshine, please hold." We just got a kick out of that. That was just funny.
Good. Would anybody else have to?
For memories, I would just like to thank all of you here for what a wonderful time we've had tonight. And as we would head an organization and then kind of get where we're not active anymore, the question always is, well, what has happened since? What's happened in the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years? And I am delighted that NABBA, first of all, has continued to exist, and that the competition has certainly spawned some very competitive and interesting bands, and we maybe need to take a step back with what we're doing with the community band, but this is a good sign that we're not only looking backwards, but we're looking forward. So thank you all. This has been a great evening.
Well, and I'd like to say how good everybody looks. I haven't seen y'all in forever. Everybody looks so good.
That's been a while.
Right.
John Lambert, you had your hand raised?
Tom Meyer.
I think just a couple of things on the bridge, because I think that's an important change that we're making. And Steve Bulla had mentioned online a couple of days ago that he had the same thought that I did. It seemed like we had lost a lot of the
Are you guys able to hear me?
documentation of history. And so during the time that I was the editor of the Bridge, which was 1989 through 1992, a lot of the stories were relatively short-lived, short life, but there were articles that were very valuable for almost forever. And I think in terms of the Brass Band of Columbus and the story and the first brass band who presented at the International Midwest Band or an Orchestra Clinic, and the follow-on on that when several years later, the Midwest got up to the podium and said, we are inviting all brass bands to play at the Midwest. Dr. Droste's article on taking the difficulty out of double and triple tonguing. Carol Dawn Reinhardt's story on Wiener Stoss and reducing performance risks. The inventory interview I did with Sam Danoff, who had been with the Chicago Symphony in the percussion section for 31 years, discussing cymbals for British brass bands, selection, sizing, performance tips, aging, and so on. And that's still relevant today. And there is the only source that I know of where his lifetime experience is applied directly to British brass bands. It was really a first-rate article, issue 41. The discussions, conversations between Paul Droste, Philip Spark, Bob Burnett, and me are still relevant, issues 51 and 52. Same thing with Steve Bulla on Firestorm and the use of mutes, and Jeffrey Brand's discussion on Elgar's Sovereign Suite. So those are examples of things that I hope to see coming back to the Bridge and to the brass band discussions, because I think they're important as a musical foundation to send the band further into the future rather than just worried about, you know, what are they playing or what were the latest pieces that were reported.
And almost all those old NABBA bridges are still available on the NABBA website.
Yep.
So everybody knows.
Yep. And unfortunately, you're going to get one of 22 pages on snare drum selection and tuning, updated from 1993.
Oh my!
You know, well,
good read.
As Paul Droste used to say about Paul Byerly, he would give a 10-minute introduction to a 3-minute march. Well, this one is 22 pages for 3 pages of content.
That's great. Hey,
John, what you do with that one?
John, do you want to say anything before we close out?
Yeah, just something for you to discuss with the editor of the Bridge. I write for School Band and Orchestra magazine, and one of the things that they have evolved into that you might want to consider is, rather than saying we're going to have 3 issues or 4 issues or something like that, it's just in a continuing stream of content. Our media really isn't based around waiting for a quarterly issue that by the time it comes out, the news is already old. And so they are constantly adding, 2 or 3 new news items almost every day, rather than waiting for issues. So that might be something. If you're going to an all digital platform, you might want to consider just having it be a stream of content rather than every 3 or 4 months an issue.
Yeah, Tom?
I generally agree with that. I think having an electronic format that's formal And an archive is perfect, assuming that the searchable archive can be transferred as technology changes. But what we've seen happen, I think, is that something will show up on a Facebook page or website, and all of a sudden it's gone. You never knew it was there, so you never knew how to search for it. And a lot of stuff just was lost in the process. So that's one of the things that, you know, clearly I don't want to go back to paper, but you do need to make sure that it's saved so that if you do look for the right stuff, you can find it.
Excellent. I mean, that's great advice. I know that one of the challenges we have with dealing with content now is timeliness. You know, in a quarterly, what can you put in a quarterly that won't be outdated by 3 months by the time people read it? You know, so we'll have to figure out, you know, how do you integrate the use of Facebook and Twitter and Instagram for current and timely content versus content that will stand the test of time, that you can, you know, like articles and concert programs and the historical record of NABBA in the quarterly. So we'll have to bridge the gap between the two mediums to figure out how.
I think that's been figured out by folks like the New York Times when they wrestled with what's the paper versus what's the online, and it's they evolved toward the pressing news is online, but the more thoughtful pieces, the more thorough analysis, the more features would at least initially go to the newspaper, the paper version. And they've gone more and more toward essentially the newspaper online, but with the thought pieces still there and accessible, so that you didn't just get the blizzard of the last hiccup, but more thoughtful thinking.
Yeah, and one of the challenges we'll also be dealing with is that the bridge always relied on user-generated content. You know, so getting contributors to send in things and produce the interesting articles will be something that we also have a challenge of keeping going as well.
Well, Tony, let me give you just a reflection, and I want to thank Paul Droste and Ron Holz for the 4 years that I was doing the editorship for the bridge, that I could pretty well count on Paul and Ron giving me something that would help fill the pages. And sometimes the pages were 24 pages or 36 pages. And I'd have to cook up the rest of what was going to be in there. A lot of times we would assign a correspondent for each band, where the band would assign somebody to be the correspondent. And they were supposed to tell us what the band was doing and what they were playing. And, you know, it was supposed to be on automatic, but it never happened. You know, the correspondents just never got there to do it. And so you end up saying, okay, how about send me a program at least so we can talk about what you've been doing. So there's the challenge, is overcoming that. I think you'll find once you open the doors to more thoughtful articles, I don't know that the snare drum piece will be more thoughtful, but you know, they will come. I don't think there's too much worry on that, as much as the band news still tends to be hit or miss.
Awesome. Well, I think we should probably wrap it up here. You know, Pat and I had a discussion earlier. I believe it was Tom that made the suggestion about having a topic about dealing with COVID and how bands are handling these situations as we go forward. And I think Pat and I are gonna try to set up a separate session that deals with just that, which is a fascinating topic and something that all the bandsmen in the world are dealing with right now. So Pat and I will start working on that. So look for an announcement about the next session that we'll do in this new way of creating content for people to pay attention to as the brass band world is on pause. I'd like to personally thank all of you for joining us in this session. It was a fascinating and fun time to go back to the first 25 years, as you are the actual people that put the platform and the foundation down for this organization. And we look forward to continuing that and growing and driving to the next level as you have done so greatly in the first 25 years. So we will say good night.
Thank you for
everybody.
inviting.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Enjoy.
Everyone,
Thank you.
See ya.
Enjoy. See you. Bye.
bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.